I was doing a little bit of practice in the car on the way here, thinking like, what if I break out into song accidentally partway through? I cannot.
Welcome to Psychocinematic, the podcast where we analyse depictions of mental illness and disability in popular film and TV.
We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we record this podcast today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We recognise their continued connection to the land and waters of this place and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We respect all elders and ancestors and any First Nations people listening here today. So I have with me today a very special guest of the podcast, my wife, Dr Elise McGlashan.
Yes.
Welcome to the podcast, Elise.
Thank you, Steph. Thanks for having me. Yes, it's about time after all this time with your husband on the show
that I invite my wife on.
Exactly.
Can you tell me a little bit about your background and just yourself?
Yes, absolutely. I was thinking about on my way here how I can make myself qualified or sound qualified to be here.
You are a doctor.
I am technically a doctor, depending on who you ask, a real or a fake doctor, I'm not sure. But I have a background in psychology, so I did a Bachelor of Psychology and did my honours in psychology as well, and then I did a PhD in psychology. So I am technically a doctor.
That's a very technical doctor.
Yes, officially. So my background is really in the area of sleep and circadian rhythms, or the body clock, but really how those things relate to different mental health conditions. So in particular, depression and bipolar disorder has been my focus so far, and also looking at how antidepressants affect our sleep and our body clock as well.
So if anyone has any sleep questions, if you're listening to the podcast, Elise, she answers all my sleep questions all the time. So it's really good having a wife who understands sleep.
Yes. One of the 3 pillars of health, of course.
And it's funny because we're not doing a movie or a TV show about sleep today, but I know we will eventually. It's just hard to find something that's specifically about that realm.
I think so. I think it's a tricky one, I suppose, with our kind of lens, because a lot of the time when sleep issues are covered in media, because sleep problems are something that are so common, that are experienced by everyone, to different degrees. Of course, there are pathologies as well, but it's also a very common part of everyday life that they sort of might show up in smaller ways throughout media, but there's maybe not so much where it's sort of the central focus.
Yeah. I can think of The Science of Sleep, but I don't remember that movie, so I'll have to go back and watch it.
Yeah, probably not a good sign if you can't remember.
Can we follow you on Twitter is the next question.
We can follow me on Twitter.
I'll put your creds on.
Collectively. I don't follow myself on Twitter, though I would if I could.
I would too.
Yes. It's just at Elise McGlashan, so it's just my name.
Yes.
Nice and easy to find.
And you're doing lots of research as we speak. Like right now, I can see in this room you're doing research.
In this room,
now.
Precisely. I do actually have a research subject behind me. Really had to make this fit in my schedule.
It's actually true.
A little. No, I am doing lots of research at the moment. So at the moment I am studying the effects of antidepressants on the way that our body responds to light. So light has lots of important effects on our mood and of course on our sleep as well. And my work so far has shown that antidepressants such as SSRIs, so the most common ones, tend to increase the effect of light on our bodies, and that may be beneficial for treatment for some people, and on the other hand may actually be some of the reasons that they don't work for lots of people.
That's really interesting. But I'll link some of the papers in the show notes as well so everyone can have a read.
Maybe we can link my Google Scholar or something in the show notes.
Yes,
what a very fun one.
Because your work has been reported and you've been on the news. And
yes, been on the radio a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can probably, actually that's a better idea. I can give you some links to some news articles, or I did have an article published about one of my papers on IFL science.
I fucking love
science a few months ago, which was a life achievement that I didn't know I needed, but turns out I absolutely did, and I was very stoked about it.
You know you've made it when you're in I fucking love science. What we're doing today, I've been wanting you to be on the podcast to talk about this with me for some time now, possibly years, now that I think about it.
Honestly, I think we discussed this before you started the podcast.
But we're here.
So it's been a while. My apologies for that.
No, it's not your fault. It's life.
It's the
COVID,
it's the world.
everything.
Yeah. I do have another apology to make to you, Steph, actually. I didn't tell you about this, but you did a little poll today relating to, how people feel about musicals, I assume in anticipation of this wonderful episode.
Possibly.
And I answered that I love them, but I have to admit that was kind of a lie. And that actually I feel like I have had as a core part of my identity for most of my life that I hate musicals.
And I'm also not a huge fan of musicals, typically.
Yeah.
And that was what their fine response was for, really.
Yeah, like I think I wouldn't say they're fine because I don't feel neutrally.
Yeah.
I either feel very, very strongly that I hate them or they are my favourite thing. So it does probably average out to they're fine.
It's very black and white thinking, which is what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, maybe you should think about that with your next poll options.
I need to have another one. Like, I like some musicals desperately, but hate every other one.
Yes, because it's possible to cover every possible answer, of course.
Yeah, it's true. But yeah, it was about today, and it's because we are covering a musical, but as someone who tends to really dislike musicals and finds it really weird and uncomfortable watching musicals, I love this show, and there are musicals that I desperately love too.
Absolutely. I would completely agree. Like as much as I say I've made it a part of my core identity that I dislike musicals, I would also say that this is, if not my favourite, one of my very, very, very top favourite TV shows of all time. And like I think Bo Burnham's Inside last year was the best piece of media to come out of
COVID.
What was a terrible year.
Yeah. 2 years, really.
Yeah, exactly. So despite my general disdain, these two very special, and this one today in particular has been a love of mine for a very long time.
Same, which is why we're doing it together, Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. And also because Michael won't watch it with me no matter how many times I try, put it on, hope that he'll absorb it through osmosis. He just doesn't want a bar of it because he's someone who hates musicals and hasn't given it a chance.
Yeah. This is why you must have a wife as well as a husband.
Exactly. I recommend it to everyone. And I guess neither of us have lived experience of the mental illness, well, the main mental illness depicted in the show, which is borderline personality disorder. But we definitely see ourselves in many of the characters and experiences and things that happen on the show. So I think we'll be able to talk to it with that caveat.
Of course.
Yeah. Very well. Rebecca Bunch is a Yale and Harvard educated lawyer who works for a top New York City law firm. But when she's offered a promotion, she panics, flees the building, and just happens to encounter Josh Chan, who she dated at school camp as a teenager. Josh tells her that she's moving back to his hometown of West Covina. She decides to follow Josh to West Covina, California, in search of happiness, but of course in denial that Josh is the reason that she decided to move. She gets a job at Darryl Whitefeather's law firm and becomes friends with the firm's paralegal, Paula, and her neighbour, Heather, and begins an on-again, off-again relationship with Greg, who's Josh's friend, all while trying desperately to connect with Josh, much to the displeasure of his girlfriend, Valencia. In the second season, Rebecca begins a tumultuous romantic relationship with Josh after Valencia dumps him. Greg leaves town to go to university, and Rebecca and Valencia begin to become friends. Meanwhile, the wealthy, narcissistic, I would say, Nathaniel Plimpton becomes a partner at Darryl's firm. Hoping to cement their troubled relationship, Rebecca and Josh plan to be married, but he leaves her at the altar to become a priest.
Dun, dun, dun.
In the third season, Rebecca's emotional state hits rock bottom and she attempts suicide. She gets a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder and begins to attempt to take better care of her mental health, take responsibility for her actions. She starts to date Nathaniel, and then a series of events leads to Rebecca pushing her stalker, who I think also has borderline personality disorder, Trent, or maybe he's a bit of a psychopath, to be honest. Anyway.
He's got a lot going on, I think.
There's a lot there. Trent.
Or is he just a boy in love?
He's not responsible for his actions. So she pushes him off a roof, and then she's trialed, pleads guilty to the crime and goes to jail, determined to take responsibility for all the actions she's done as penance. In the 4th season, she gets out of jail, quits her job at the law firm, starts her own pretzel-making company, and then everyone sort of drifts off to their own sort of life commitments. And then Greg comes back. And with everyone being a bit more emotionally healthy, Rebecca feels pressured to choose between her romances with potentials Josh, Nathaniel, and Greg. And I'll just leave it there.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to spoil the ending. We will, but...
We will probably
we
inevitably
definitely will.
spoil the ending. And
but I think that's a good place to leave it.
In the interest of the fact that we probably will spoil the ending, I do want to add a fun little side note that Greg comes back as a completely different actor, and it is very hilarious the way
so
that they...
well done.
The way that they achieve that change. It's very meta, and if you haven't seen it, you'll enjoy that.
Yeah,
I think.
Season 4 is really good. Like, Valencia comes back, she's like, I'm here for the whole series. And they're like, what? Yeah. Of seasons and events, culture.
Of holidays,
yes.
you know, Christmas, Valentine's, Easter.
It's a very meta show. It's so cheeky in the way it delivers itself, and it doesn't take itself too seriously, but it also deals with some really serious things.
It does. It manages to do that with a lot of humour and self-awareness and also accuracy somehow.
Yes. I don't know. See, that's why it's so perfect. I don't know how it achieves all those things at once.
I don't know.
Plus, it's a musical.
Rachel Bloom is a machine.
Let me just go through the criteria for borderline personality disorder. BPD is a pervasive pattern of instability in interpersonal relationships, self-image, and emotion, as well as marked impulsivity beginning by early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts, as indicated by 5 or more of the following 9 traits. The first is chronic feelings of emptiness, emotional instability in reaction to day-to-day events, for example, intense episodic sadness, irritability, or anxiety, usually lasting a few hours and only rarely more than a few days. Frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. Identity disturbance with markedly or persistently unstable self-image or sense of self. Impulsive behaviour in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging. For example, spending, sex, substance abuse, reckless driving, and binge eating. Inappropriate or intense anger, or difficulty controlling anger. For example, frequent displays of temper, constant anger, and recurrent physical fights. Pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships, characterized by extremes between idealization and devaluation, which is also known as splitting. Recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures or threats, or self-harming behavior. And transient stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. And it's just important to recognise the essential features of a personality disorder in itself, because I'm sure we can relate to a lot of the symptoms presented in different ways, but it becomes a personality disorder when it impacts on your functioning. So it's impairments in your personality, self and interpersonal functioning, and the presence of pathological personality traits. So in order to have those traits diagnosed as a personality disorder, the following criteria needs to be met. Firstly, significant impairments in self, identity or self-direction, and interpersonal functioning, interpersonal being empathy or intimacy. 1 or more pathological personality trait domains or trait facets. The impairments in personality functioning and the individual's personality trait expression are relatively stable across time and consistent across situations. So it has to be in all situations that you experience this impairment. And the impairments in personality functioning and the individual's personality trait expression are not better understood as a normative for the individual's developmental stage or sociocultural environment. And that's important to recognise because most teenagers, particularly teenage girls, wouldn't meet the criteria for BPD. I probably was one of them when I was younger. And lastly, of course, the impairments in personality functioning and the individual's personality trait expression are not solely due to the direct physiological effects of a substance, such as a drug of abuse or medication. So it can't be explained by drugs, alcohol, etc. We'll start talking about lived experience of the actors. I'll obviously start with Rachel Bloom, and I will try not to go too in-depth because I think what we know about the show is they didn't actually intend for Rebecca to have borderline personality disorder at the beginning. I always say personality disorder.
It's just your Australian
but that's what
coming
I'm doing.
out.
And then they actually research, what does this person who has all these traits, what are they likely to have? And then it sort of fit bill, which I kind of like.
I think it possibly contributes. I don't want to interrupt you too much before you go into this section, but I think that really contributes to how it is such an accurate portrayal of this particular condition, because the reality is that as human beings, we don't grow up knowing what the proverbial boxes that will end up being put in as an adult, or whenever in life we might discover what the thing is that describes our experiences. And so, we don't behave in exactly the ways that you would expect based on a on-paper diagnosis.
On a checklist, yeah.
And it means that they're able to portray a very authentic human experience with varied symptoms that could fit into different boxes at different times and that change and evolve with her different relationships. So that ultimately you end up with this really accurate and authentic representation that hasn't been built out of criteria.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in one of our last episodes, Atypical, we talk about how they look like they wanted a checkbox, someone who ticks the box of autism, and in the end he looked like a checkbox character. And Eric and I were saying how they did auditions with people, but it wasn't what they were looking for. And those people with autism did get the role because it wasn't what she was looking for. And it's like, no, you should have gone with the person before you go to the checklist, which is what they did here. Because it becomes, like you say, more nuanced and more of an accurate, well-rounded representation.
Yeah, because I suppose the reality is of, all people living with all number of different mental health conditions is that, sure, we have these checklists, but it's pretty rare that you find someone that meets every single criteria, ticks off every single box. And so everybody is, parts of themselves that relate to that condition, parts of themselves that don't. They might have some components and not others. They might manifest in different ways. And so the reality is that if you try and build somebody with every single symptom to a T, you're going to end up with a very unrealistic looking person.
Cartoonish.
Yeah.
And having said that, there are aspects of her character which is a little bit embellished and over the top, but it is an embellished over the top show, so it works.
Yeah, exactly. I think, being a musical serves it there, and then there's a lot of sort of out there aspects, but it doesn't feel like it's in service of creating a very specific, checkbox character. It's just sort of a virtue of the show overall, and perhaps all of the characters have aspects of themselves that are like that.
And it also didn't start out by saying this person has borderline. Let's portray this person right now. This is what our aim is. It wasn't really about that initially.
No. Yeah.
So it worked out well. So Rachel Bloom, I found out a little bit of detail. She's spoken a lot, so I didn't want to go into a bit of an internet black hole, and please add anything as well, because we both love her deeply. But she has spoken that she has had quite an experience of major depressive episodes and severe anxiety as a youngster, as well as while creating Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. And she later on came out to say, yes, I've been diagnosed with OCD as well. So she's definitely had a lot of experience with mental illness and with breakups and with all of the things that happen on the show pretty much. A quote from her is that, I don't have borderline personality disorder. However, I've dealt with many other things that are incredibly personal to me that I think are important to share. And I think you see that a lot in the show.
Absolutely.
It feels very natural to her, the way she portrays it.
Absolutely. And I think perhaps, the fact that they didn't write the show around a particular diagnosis and kind of let the character and the story guide where that ultimately went kind of speaks to that as well, that she's really tried to put her authentic experiences in there without any particular label and kind of see what comes out. And so I don't think it matters that she hasn't had borderline specifically.
I feel like it doesn't, because of the way they wrote the show. She didn't say, I'm going to write a person with this diagnosis. She wrote aspects of herself and probably embellished them and then went, hey, let's look at what would happen to this character, and that's what would happen. So I think it's good writing.
Yeah, and I think maybe what I was thinking there is that, often we would look at things like this and think, well, this is a very, serious condition that can have a really big impact on people's lives, and is it a good thing for somebody who doesn't have lived experience with that particular condition to be writing a show that ultimately ends up built around that? But I think because she is able to draw on her own experiences so authentically, it still comes across as very empathetic and understanding and sincere. Yeah. And I think relatable to people who do have that particular experience.
Exactly. And the articles I have read on people with borderline who have watched the show have felt very seen through the show and felt that it was a really good depiction and actually sort of helps their mental health in the form of the songs as well that are super relatable. So it's done good, and for that reason it doesn't quite matter so much that she doesn't have that specific diagnosis.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because she does it justice. And as Eric Garcia said as well, just because you don't have the thing doesn't mean you can't create something about the thing. It's just how you do it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that this show anyway, let's not be too much huge fangirls of Rachel Bloom, although we are.
Yes.
I think that she is a really good example, and this show is a really good example that can be done respectfully and accurately, even by someone without that specific experience.
I've gone through some of the other characters as well, just in terms of, because pretty much everyone on the show has either some mental ill health or potential mental illnesses themselves. Donna Lynn Champlin, who plays Paula, did say that she's had, during making the last season, has had some mental ill health during that time, and she said she had to make some emergency calls to a therapist in that last season, and was just like, I have no shame about that. You need to take care of yourself. And she did say it's been hard because of how I grew up, and the dynamics that I set up for myself are very similar to the ones I play in this show. Sometimes it gets a little too close, so you shake it off, call your therapist, and it's back to work. So I thought that was a good quote to show a little bit of insight that Donna has experienced some of the things that Paula experiences on the show, which also I think rings true for an authentic, excellent portrayal of Paula the character.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Paula the character in the show, doesn't at any point, and I think we'll speak about this a little bit later, but she doesn't have any formal diagnoses. And so, yeah, it's interesting to see that Donna's life experiences, I suppose, came through in a very authentic way, which I think really speaks to, we all have varying experiences with mental health and psychological well-being across our lives. Whether or not we end up with a diagnosable condition that requires XYZ, we all have sort of relatable life experiences like that. That can be very helpful for people.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely. The character who plays Heather has also mentioned that she focuses a lot on her well-being, both physical and mental, and sort of explains about how you never sort of arrive at a place where all of a sudden you figured everything out and everything is perfect, which is very similar to sort of her character's journey as well.
Absolutely.
The character who plays Josh as well, Vincent Rodriguez the second. I think he's got
Possibly.
a thing at the end of his name.
I can never remember when people have those, but good job.
Yeah. He really struggled during the pandemic, so he's mentioned that he's was really depressed during that time. So yeah, it's definitely after the show was finished, but shows that he's in touch with his emotions, and he sort of plays those off really well. And Nathaniel, the character who plays Nathaniel, is also very into mental health representation as well in his career. So I feel like she definitely singled out people in these roles who were comfortable with mental illness, were okay with portraying some level of that and having those conversations about it, which I think is really
absolutely. Varying levels across the cast, I suppose, of, maybe lived experience with mental illness, but certainly she's put together a team of people who are all very respectful and open and willing to talk about their own experiences growing up and their own experiences with mental health.
Yeah.
And that really probably contributes to why we love the show so much.
It's true. And I just had a thought too, because it's a very diverse cast in terms of representation of people of colour and cultures and LGBTI representation as well. And they're all very theatre background, because they can all do they're all triple threaders. They can sing, dance and act. So to be able to bring people together all that talented, as well as from all different walks of life, is pretty incredible. But also it probably speaks to the community that they're from as well.
Yeah, I was about to say the exact same thing. I don't think it's a coincidence that when you bring together a group of triple threats who are so talented and who have really, thrived in that community, that they also have a lot of self-awareness and very conscious of mental health and open to talking about things like that.
And potentially have had their own experiences
Absolutely.
of that. Because it is quite a maligned industry in which to be in.
Yeah.
Before we discuss how accurate we think the depiction is, what I read from interviews is that they consulted with mental health professionals about her character and had a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists talk about what her actions and what the diagnosis would be. So they really didn't just like get out the DSM and go, oh, what do you reckon? They actually consulted with mental health professionals, which I really appreciate. So like from what you know, Elise, as a doctor of psychology, how do you think the depiction of borderline comes through in the show?
I mean, it's a funny one to talk about, I think, in terms of accuracy because of what we know about the fact that they did not set out to represent borderline. But I think that perhaps the conclusions that the therapist that they consulted with and the direction they decided to go in with the show based on her behaviour is relatively accurate. So one thing in particular that I think is very accurate, perhaps by happy accident, is that along the way, you know, she receives many different diagnoses for different conditions. You know, she's told she has depression, anxiety, insomnia. I actually was listening to the Diagnosis song on the way here today. And there's a naturopath that tells her she's got a sex addiction.
Good on you, naturopath.
And we can, you know, putting the accuracy of those potential other random diagnoses aside, I think that experience is something that a lot of people with borderline could relate to, that they have this long history of being told they've got X, Y, Z, oh, it's not that anymore, that's not going to work, try this other medication, it's something else. And so that in particular, I think, would feel very real and very relatable to people with bipolar disorder and is an accurate representation of a lot of people's experiences, for sure.
I definitely agree. And I think that the fact that she gets to a place where she ends up in a very, very dark place where her life is threatened, that leads to that final diagnosis after being with Dr. Akopian for so many years. I think that's probably an accurate representation of when it gets to the point of like, hang on, what is actually underlying all of the symptomology right now. Luckily, not everyone gets to that point, but also not everyone gets that experience of having that longevity with a psychologist to get to that final diagnosis at the end.
Absolutely, which, you know, because it is sort of an ongoing pattern of behaviour that will impact people's lives to varying degrees across their life. Like you said, it's not necessarily something where you could just go in for one session and come out and you've got the right label and off you go. Here's a treatment plan.
And you wouldn't want a psychologist to do that anyway.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
So what? And that's the difficulty with diagnosing borderline personality disorder, is because a lot of the patterns of the disorder, such as having very unstable lives and relationships and very impulsive ways to avoid abandonment, can mean them leaving before you get to that point. And you see it in the show being presented with that confrontation from her friends and from Dr. Akopian. Her response is to leave. And that's common. So it's hard to get that stability enough to get to that diagnosis, which is why personality disorders are often hard to diagnose for that reason.
Absolutely. And I think also, you know, maybe you can speak to this better, Steph, but also perhaps some psychologists see it questionably as a helpful diagnosis because borderline in particular is quite stigmatised.
Yes, hugely.
And so it might be something that you're sort of cautious to diagnose someone with, even if you do have a suspicion. You know, I think in the show, Dr. Akopian, certainly once she receives that diagnosis from her psychiatrist, is very much in agreement about it.
Yes.
And it seems like perhaps had thought that for a while and had, for whatever reason, chosen to withhold that from Rebecca.
Yes.
Probably because of how Rebecca receives the news.
Yes. Thought that was really well portrayed. But it's almost like you have to pick your moment of going, this is what I think you have. And they have to be at a place to be able to accept that. And it looked like Rebecca was getting to that place where she could accept it. Initially, which I think was very accurate, she rejected it. But then when presented with those 9 symptoms, she couldn't help but accept it. And also her response afterwards of being like, this means that I'm broken, was also very relatable.
Sadly, I think I would agree that is probably a bit of a roller coaster that a lot of people who have received that diagnosis have gone through. Yeah,
which is really sad because there is, like, when she Googles all the things, and the doctors all say, don't Google it. And of course she Googles it, and it has lots of really negative statistics, some of which are sadly true. Like there is a higher likelihood of suicidal behaviour in people with borderline.
There's even stigma around sometimes in certain groups of clinicians of working with patients with bipolar disorder, unfortunately.
Exactly. Michael has mentioned that in his psychiatry trainings.
He has.
Which is really, and you can see Dr. Okopian gets very frustrated with Rebecca many times. So they even portray that. So it's unfortunate because of this messaging. There's not a lot of that positive messaging in the media of people with borderline are out there and living their best lives and have friends, have relationships, have jobs, have careers.
And there are tools available. There are going to be psychologists that want to work with you and want to help you cope and make sure that you have things in place to live your best life and do really well.
Yes. And there's also, positives that come with the condition. Like someone like Rebecca goes on to have a very creative, you assume, at the end. She writes her songs.
Does she?
Oops. Spoiler. And she's a very loving presence with everyone. So,
yeah, she's a wonderful, wonderful, loving friend. Absolutely.
Yeah. I really like the depiction of where it comes from too, potentially, with her mum being a very narcissistic, probably also on borderline, definitely borderline traits as well, and that feeling of abandonment from her father, where some of those that sense of abandonment has come from. I think that's very accurate as to what can precede the symptomology,
the development of that sort of pattern of behaviour and well-being. Yeah. I almost was going to bring that up as a potential stereotype.
True.
But I think it is also unfortunately accurate for the etiology of the condition. Often, people with borderline may not have great relationships with their parents, and sometimes it comes from that sort of disordered attachment.
Yes. And there's a school of thought that borderline is actually complex developmental trauma and trauma attachment in a diagnostic form, which I tend to ascribe to because often that is the case.
Agreed, yeah.
We sound very clinical, Elise.
We do. So another thing that I think they portray quite well in the show and quite accurately is her tendency to experience some sort of dissociative symptoms and perhaps some also it's not quite psychotic symptoms, but you're thinking outside of perhaps the realms of reality.
Yes, definitely.
So some examples being, she definitely does dissociate in the show. There's a few examples of that.
And I guess that's what she's doing all the way through the show with her musical numbers.
Yes, exactly. Turns out, spoiler alert,
it's all happening in her head.
We find out that it's all in her head.
Yeah.
Not the whole show. I don't think it would be one of my favourite shows if it was gets to the end of the 4th season and it was all a dream.
But you sort of notice in season 2 when I'm just a girl in love, she's like, oh no, I just created you. This is all in my head.
Yeah. Exactly.
So we know.
We know. There are hints at it throughout, certainly. Yeah. But there are some specific events in the show as well that speak to that thinking. Dr. Phil makes a couple of appearances, for example.
Dream ghosts.
So she has a dream where she believes that she's, on the plane with her psychologist and they have a real big breakthrough and it's a very otherworldly experience, I suppose. But also, in Dr. Phil and also her exes, she will have hallucinations or it's not clear whether it's a full hallucination or whether it's sort of a very, very active imagination. I think it's sort of
a combination of both, maybe, or
possibly,
a bit blurry,
but definitely some very creative thinking. Dr. Phil does make a couple of appearances on the show, whether or not he is imagined, and it is
very good.
Very good.
But is it problematic?
I was going to say,
we'll get to that.
It's good fun, but interesting choice.
Yes, very interesting choice.
Now that I think about it, yeah.
Rachel, why did you do us that way?
She assembled this wonderful team of empathetic and open and talented people, and then she invited Dr. Phil. So an interesting choice, but it did fit very well with the story, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, it was.
Yeah,
it was it was the perfect character.
It was the right person, and it's almost funny that he's there as an imagined figure or a hallucination, as if he's not really there, because you kind of forget watching the show that he had to be there on set.
Yeah, Dr. Phil was on set.
Yeah.
And it's a show, sort of smashing mental health stigma, and then you've got Dr. Phil is like the worst representation of a therapist that I can think of.
Yeah. So another thing I think they do quite well in the show is that a common feature of borderline is the experience of identity disturbance, or maybe some instability in that sense of identity. And certainly we see Rebecca. I often forget whether I'm referring to Rachel or Rebecca, but Rebecca in the show certainly have some really profound changes in her personality depending on the relationship she's invested in. So we certainly see evidence of her, really playing up certain aspects of her personality or making up new ones, circa Ping Pong Girl.
Yes, that's right.
Which is one of my favourite songs, I think. But also, even with her friendships as well, she starts to feel some distance in her friendship with Paula, so she gets much closer with this younger group of gals and starts to really take on their sort of persona and their interests and even their fashion sense and things like that. And so she's really clinging on to these aspects of their identity to try and kind of craft one for herself, I think, to try and feel a bit of stability there.
Yeah, and same in the last season when her friends are sort of moving on and buying houses and having kids and getting married, and she's like, well, I'm not there, so I've got to be fizzy with the cool kids.
Exactly.
And even things like with sexy French depression, like, I'm going to be the depressed sexy girl now.
Yes,
When
exactly.
she is genuinely depressed, but it's also like putting it on like, this is me, which is often, I've definitely felt that way as a teenager. Like, I'm feeling down, so I'll just be the depressed girl in a sort of glamorized sense. Yeah. So I really relate to that that song particularly.
Yeah, I think we all can a little bit. Yes, definitely.
And then sort of at the end in that 11 o'clock sequence where she's trying on all the different personalities, like, who am I actually? And then finding a way to put all those personalities into her art form, which becomes writing her songs down.
Yeah, you're right. I don't think I'd quite conceptualize that song and that sequence in that way. It is beautiful, though.
I love it.
I love it. It's an amazing way to sort of wrap things up a little bit. But you're right, sort of trying on all of the things and all of the people that she has been across the series, and I think also in a way finding a way to accept that these are all parts of her, rather than trying to kind of fit herself into, I am this kind of person or that kind of person, that she can be all of those things and sort of embrace all of the different aspects.
Do you know what too? It's kind of like when we've done Sybil with all the 17 personalities with someone with dissociative identity disorder, and I feel like maybe some people with borderline might have been diagnosed DID. I have absolutely no evidence to suggest that, but the representation of her trying on all these different personas could be seen as a person, like a DID, sort of a dissociative disorder, but it's like aspects of dissociation, but it's more explained by borderline in that they're all parts of her, but they're not like distinct personalities themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Agree. Yeah, so we've already touched briefly on the fact that the show does depict at least one attempt at suicide, although there are two in her life at least that we know about.
That's true,
that are sort of shown to varying degrees. And that there are at times sort of threats, or she does engage in quite impulsive and behaviour that could result in harm to herself as
self-destructive.
Well. Yeah.
And harm to other people, her relationships as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. It's so strange almost to talk about the fact that these things are represented so well in the show in such a respectful and I think accurate way for people who do have experiences with those kinds of things, given that it is a silly musical.
But I was just thinking that too, because it's like their internal monologue. It's her internal monologue in song form. So it sort of explains why I'm doing this behavior, because XYZ, naturally, this is my pattern of behavior. I'm going to go and sleep with Greg's dad or whatever it is. You can kind of empathize more with
Never
her.
fuck your ex-boyfriend's dad. A key learning from Greg's ex-girlfriend.
Imagine it. Don't. It gives you empathy for the behaviour, because you kind of understand where it comes from, I guess.
It's an excellent point in that, often I think, we might, if there are behaviours like that are depicted in media, they're often sort of depicted as very outrageous and, oh my gosh, how could anybody do that? Whereas the show does a really great job of really taking you on that journey with her and seeing how she gets to those decisions. And certainly I think could evoke a very, very good level of empathy in the audience I'm sure that the audience is mainly made up of very aware and mentally health conscious individuals, but everybody is capable of being a little bit judgmental about people's decisions and that sort of thing.
Hell yeah, including myself.
Absolutely, me too. But I think the show does a really good job of helping you to really see it from her perspective and be a bit more forgiving of those choices.
Yeah,
except maybe sleeping with your ex-boyfriend.
Yeah, probably the lowest she's gone. And I guess I just want to also mention that splitting. Because that was one thing that I always rang with me when I learnt about borderline in my studies, is that splitting. Like, you're either best friends or worst enemies, and there's no in between. And I always thought that meant people with borderline would just cut you out of their life. But as you see with Rebecca, she doesn't. She ends up staying friends with people, even though I don't know if they would all be friends with her in real life at this point, because she's put them through the ringer a few times. But
possibly that speaks to what experiences and things those other people might also be dealing with.
That's exactly true. Like, for example, when they try and intervene, she brings out the most awful attacks on all of them, goes off to do the swim fan thing, which is always very funny, and then becomes best friends with a random backpacker and says, "You're the only person who understands me." It's that I need to, and she's like that with all the guys in the relationships too. She very much gives all her intensity to one person, and if that isn't given back or something goes wrong, then it's, I've blown it, I'll go to the next person. But doesn't mean the previous person isn't also a possibility. So it's that instability, really.
Yeah, agreed. I think I probably would have, at some time in the past also conceptualized that splitting in that way of that, you're my best friend until you're not, and then you're gone out of my life. And that's probably not the reality of how most people experience that kind of instability. Like you said, it's much more sort of waxing and waning and very harsh turns, but not necessarily cutting people out of her life. So I think when I was thinking about this sort of idea of maybe the splitting and some of the emotional stability, I was thinking today about how really to some degree, and not to minimize the experience of people with borderline, because I absolutely don't wish to do that, but that they're actually much more relatable experiences than I think we give credit for. And I think a lot of people can relate to having periods in their life where they're perhaps a bit on and off with their friends, or they have a bit of instability because of things that they've got going on. And I don't mean to suggest that it's to the same degree, or that it's just normal and get on with it by any means, but I think it's a real shame that the condition is so stigmatized when actually a lot of the experiences of people with borderline are just perhaps more extreme versions of pretty, normal things that we all experience in relationships.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
We all go through the highs and the lows that she experiences in her relationships with people and her friendships as well, but it's at a different level, I guess.
Yeah. It's about that sort of, I guess, impact that it's having on your life. Perhaps for some people it doesn't have sort of a functional impact or doesn't impair their ability to engage in their relationships and their work and their life and that sort of thing. And that's where that line is.
Yeah.
But really they're not, they're not otherworldly experiences.
No,
relationships are difficult and also life is difficult.
Don't we bloody know it.
Yeah. And so, I think the show does a really good job of humanizing those experiences and making it clear how just, perhaps relatable they are to a broader audience than people would assume.
Definitely. I think she says at one point she's so used to living life in the extreme, she doesn't know how to be just in sort of an okay state.
Yes.
Which I think speaks to it. We've all been in those extremes. For Rebecca or someone with borderline personality, being in that sort of nothing much going on, just plugging away is hard.
Is the unusual feeling.
Yeah, it's
is
not
the
a
uncomfortable feeling. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Should we talk about the depiction of therapy?
Yes.
And treatment?
Absolutely. Love to.
What do you think about Dr. Akopian?
So I love her as a character. I think she is really great. And I think there's a lot of scenes with her and Rebecca that are really good that I think, perhaps a lot of us have had or maybe wish we had a therapist who would be so direct and, supportive but also critical of our behaviour. I think she does a really good job of balancing that those two aspects of therapy.
Definitely.
I do have some negative things to say.
Tell me.
Okay.
I might agree.
While it is one of my favourites, and I believe it is actually the song that you introduced the show to me with, I think.
Really?
This session's going to be different.
Yes.
Song.
I remember sending that.
I think you posted it on my Facebook wall. What was it?
Was that, we're just becoming friends?
Yeah, I know. Here we are.
That was risky.
It was risky, but it paid off, both in friendship and in me enjoying the show a lot. I'm pretty sure that was the first song, and then I was like, all right, I'm on board. I love that song. I think it's hilarious. I worry sometimes that it's a little bit shamey and maybe a little bit not that encouraging for people who are seeking help for the sorts of things that Rebecca is experiencing.
I totally agree. I think that song was written for therapists, not for therapy.
Agreed. But then I become really meta with it, and I'm like, okay, but then if we as the audience are like, oh, this is for therapists because it's so relatable, it makes me think, are we then perceiving all therapists as like really tired of their patients?
Here comes that client again.
Exactly, which I don't think is the reality for most therapists. I think relatable, absolutely, but it's not how most therapists are approaching every session and every patient and that kind of thing. And I worry about that perception, even though I love it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think I really enjoyed watching that for the first time and going, oh my God, this is so funny and relatable, especially my requisite therapy shawl.
Yes. To be fair, some of my favourite parts are very benign and not, because
it's true.
Not harmful.
We are either wear statement shawls, statement necklaces, or statement earrings.
Yes, absolutely.
That is always the case.
Absolutely.
It's definitely very interpretable as you clients are very draining on us sometimes, and we get very frustrated with you and just want you to fix yourself. When that's, I'm sure all of us therapists have those feelings at some stage, but, because we're humans too, and we carry a lot. But most of the time, good therapists don't have those feelings and are very empathetic and understanding and know that there's a process and a journey. And I think on top of that song, there's also the fact that she's been with Rebecca for so long, despite the fact she breaks quite a few boundaries very early on and
literally breaks into her office.
Yes, and probably should have referred her on for her own mental health.
Yes, possibly, but she persists. So
persists.
we've got to give her that.
Yeah, she does. And good thing she doesn't take health insurance, as she said. She charges more than I charged when I was in private practice.
Yes.
Expensive, but it shows what therapy is required in order for someone to make change. Sometimes it takes years of therapy.
Absolutely.
If they do have something like BPD where you need to have an attachment with your client that is unconditional and continuous and isn't going to stop at the drop of a hat, because for that person to make change and to be it was really, she was holding a space for her for when she was ready to start to delve deeply. It was there for her, and that takes time.
Absolutely. I did just want to quickly make a joke about how the fact that she's very expensive is definitely an accurate portrayal. At least in America, we have an okay system here that means that hopefully most people can get access to affordable mental health care.
Still a big gap, though.
It still can be a big gap. I'm very lucky that my psych is I think I didn't pay for my last session.
Ooh.
It was only yesterday, guys. It's okay. I need to call.
Elise.
Telehealth is hard. You've got to remember to call up after.
No, I've had a few telehealths where I was like, I've got to bank how much I need to pay her, because she just says, oh, give it to me next time I see you. And then it's like, how many times
hang on a second.
do I need to give you the gap?
Yes.
But yeah, you're right. It is expensive. And you know what? It should be expensive because it's a hard job.
It is an incredibly valuable one as well.
But it should be better resourced so people don't have to pay that money out of
so
their
that both our therapists can be appropriately compensated for their incredible work.
Yes, thank you.
And people can access care affordably. One other thing that I think they do a good job of showing that is the reality of therapy is that Rebecca often goes to Dr. Akopian in search of direction and answers, and she wants her to tell her what to do. And I know that I have done this to my own therapist. Absolutely. In fact, she accused me recently of, yes, last session I thought that you really came to me wanting me to tell you what to do. And I was like, yes, and you didn't.
That's what you're there for, isn't it?
That's why I'm paying you. But I think they did a good job of showing the reality that Dr. Akopian doesn't just tell her what to do with her life. She certainly questions her decisions when Rebecca's decisions, that is, when she feels that they might be impulsive or harmful, or she needs to better consider the repercussions of what she's doing. But she never directly instructs her on how to live her life. And I think that is an important accuracy to show.
I think they did that really well, because you could sense that she could have told her what to do, but she holds back, and that would have ruined it. And I think she probably knew, Rebecca being Rebecca, and, we're not supposed to do this anyway as therapists, but if she was to tell Rebecca what to do and it doesn't work out, well, she might lose a client and lose that relationship.
Absolutely, and lose all that progress that she's made.
Yes. What did you think about the diagnosis process and what happens after that, and her sort of journey of the treatment afterwards, after the diagnosis?
Good question. I mean, as we've discussed, I don't myself have borderline personality disorder, so I can't speak to that on a personal level of how accurate it is for my journey. But I do think the process of how she gets there is quite accurate. I think the fact that it's sort of a very long process, as we've talked about, with many inaccurate or inappropriate diagnoses along the way, it sort of leads to this real crisis point, at which point she's got not only her psychologist that she's been seeing, but the psychiatrist at the hospital. They're sort of triaging in a larger team, and that's how they come to ultimately that conclusion, with sort of years of files and her previous history and her work with Dr. Akopian. And it really takes all of that information and all of those different minds in order to land on that particular diagnosis. I think in terms of her treatment plan after that, I suppose we don't really, she goes to, I think they change her meds again to something else. They don't really talk
no, they take her off her meds.
Off all of them?
I thought so. Isn't Dr. Shine, where my treatment protocol is actually in without meds. Yeah. That's what he says at the beginning.
Yeah, I think you're right. So she comes off medication, which would be accurate for some people, not for others. Many people with many different kinds of diagnoses are on medication daily, but certainly she was taking quite a number, which is perhaps not so usual, and perhaps that's related to trying to treat, actually, probably accurate.
I think it actually
but not
is
an appropriate treatment plan for people with borderline personality disorder.
No, definitely. Sadly accurate.
Sadly accurate, yes. I think particularly perhaps in that pre-diagnosis phase where sort of just trying to treat all of these symptoms of you've got anxiety, so we'll try and keep that under control, and you have these periods of sort of depressive-like episodes, and perhaps also you've got sleep problems, and trying to address all of the, individual issues rather than thinking about what's actually going
on. Yeah.
But she attends group therapy. She does keep having individual sessions with Dr. Akopian as well. They don't really show too much in terms of what the group therapy actually is.
Yeah, I wish they did. Yeah. We only really see them when she's looking for someone to save the Darryl Whitefeather lawyer firm.
Yeah.
And it would have been good to see some actual therapy, because I assume it would have been dialectical behaviour therapy.
I was going to say, I assume it's meant to be, but all we see is her kind of joking with them and using them as a support crew when her friends are not available or, that sort of thing, which is funny and perhaps...
And what actually are in the workbooks as well.
Yes.
She gets lots of workbooks, which is also often a dialectical behaviour therapy or
DBT.
DBT.
Yeah.
Yeah, mode of therapy is often worksheets.
So it does seem like it probably is a DBT group, but we don't really see much of what that actually involves. We just know that she's doing all her homework and wants a gold star.
Yeah. I love that
she's very relatable.
I like that she tries to ace therapy, which is also a borderline trait, I have to be all or nothing. And the way that they talk that through is, you can't just win. It's a lifelong thing that you have to manage, and there's going to be days where you win and days when you lose, and that's life.
Yeah, and the effective treatment is not going to be a checkbox. It's not just that you complete all of these forms and then you're better and you're good and you don't need therapy anymore. You need to engage with the material, and it's an ongoing process, like you said.
And I like how rather than she gets the diagnosis, she's got therapy, she's better at the end. Yeah, and she gets married.
No, I think they do a good job of showing the reality of how long that process can be. And for her,
there's going to be relapses.
Absolutely. And for her, it seems like she's also quite hard on herself about about recovery, like after she kind of gets over her phase of wanting to win and get an A+ in therapy and impress everyone. I think she does kind of really embody, you know, engaging with the process, and she takes that quite seriously and kind of withdraws and decides, okay, I need to be alone, you know, until I'm better, and is quite harsh on not letting herself get involved in new relationships until she's convinced that she's 100% ready. And that's, I think, the timeline gets a little unclear in the last sort of season or so, but it's probably over a year or two that she kind of forces herself to be alone in order to heal. Perhaps a good thing, perhaps not, but she does seem to be quite hard on herself about it.
She does, and I like how the like Dr. Copian and Dr. Shine, her psychiatrist, sort of encourages her. You don't have to, because her refusing to be in a relationship is also like a borderline trait in itself. Yeah. Like I'm either alone or I'm together. There's no in between. Yeah. So they're like, you don't have to just stop yourself from having companionship or intimacy. Like you still need it in your life, but it's trying to go slowly and not getting sucked into it and stopping yourself. Yeah. And you see her start to do that a little bit when the pretty music comes up when she looks at Josh again and she goes, nope, stop.
Nope. Yep, exactly. She definitely develops a lot of self-awareness and much greater ability to sort of manage her own relationships and her, you know, emotional stability and that sort of thing, for sure. So it seems to be very effective for her over a pretty long period.
What did you think about the medication song?
I loved it.
And when she starts to go on the antidepressant.
Yeah. Look, there's no... can I say that? I don't think there is a song that I don't like in the show. Like, I swear there's probably about 20 that every time they come on, I'm like, oh, it's one of my favourites. It's really hard not to love them.
There's so many.
But the antidepressant song is wonderful. Yeah, and I think
it's one of my faves too.
I don't really have any criticisms of it because it's just so fun, and so fun about a topic that can be so serious.
Yes.
You know, people can take it as so serious. But they're right. It's so not a big deal.
I know.
You know?
And I want everyone to listen to that song.
I know.
And then realise that the person you're talking to right now probably is on some sort of form of antidepressant.
Yeah.
The person you're listening to right now is.
Yes. Well, I think it's the stat that I normally use in my writing, although it's probably a bit out of date. I'm sure it's more than this, but at least 1 in 10, probably up to a bit higher than that at the moment, but Australians are on an antidepressant, some of the highest rates in the world, interestingly.
That is very interesting.
Very.
Is it because of the federal government?
Probably it's their volume. Because we're all really depressed because of them.
Yes. This isn't a political podcast.
No. It is actually very interesting because you would kind of think instinctively that a lot of the almost Nordic countries where they have those issues with day length, maybe this is an instinctive thing to me as a chronobiologist. But anyway, we know that there's really high rates of depression in areas where they don't get much sun for lots of the year, right? They have really short days. And so I kind of would have thought that there'd be highest antidepressant use there, but no, Australia is amongst the highest. Our use of antidepressants exceeds most countries in the Western world's use of antibiotics. So the average OECD countries' use of antibiotics, we use more antidepressants than that.
That is so wild. I would not have thought that.
I know.
Maybe it's because of our... You know what? It's probably got a lot to do with our history and the fact that we were created from mass genocide.
Look, possibly. Yeah, on one hand, it's sort of like, wow, that's so much. But on the other hand, you know, I don't know whether to be happy about it because it's true that it is not a big deal and that so many of us use them. And you know, in some ways I'm happy if there are fewer barriers for people seeking and treatment and medication and less stigma. Exactly. And so, you know, I think, you know, there's probably some concern to be had there just in terms of I think we could be a lot better at how we prescribe them and how we work out what works for each person and making sure that people have the support they need while they're taking them. But the sheer numbers, almost make me happy that there's so many people who don't feel prohibited from doing so, from seeking help.
And I just wish we could talk more about it so people are just not making it as big of a deal.
Absolutely.
Unafraid to share.
Absolutely.
Guys, your therapist that you talk to probably is on antidepressants themselves.
Probably.
That's fine.
Probably.
And I like the way that she gets to agreeing to go on the medication, which was very similar to how I felt. It's like, you know, I don't want to, like, it feels like cheating sometimes. But it's not because, like the therapist said, you're doing a lot or by yourself, it's a bit of extra support to help you regulate your feelings.
And to make all that work more effective as well. Yeah.
To take some of the intensity down so you can focus on what you need to do.
Absolutely. I certainly have had the same feeling in my life. Like, I don't think I've ever had a time where I thought, like, poorly of somebody else for being on antidepressants. But when it came to myself, I don't take them now, but I have taken them in the past. And before I started taking them, my whole life I would have thought, I would never take antidepressants. I wouldn't. That's not the answer.
Yeah.
Go to therapy. And then I got very, very depressed and too depressed to engage in therapy properly. And my doctor was like, I think probably you should start antidepressants first. And I was like, I will do anything.
Yeah.
And so when it comes down to it, you know, hopefully for a lot of people, or at least for me, my experience was that any, you know, internalized stigma that I had, even though I would have never projected that onto anyone else, I definitely had it for myself, and that thankfully melted away when the need arose.
Yeah, we're our own worst critics, and
absolutely
that also comes from a bit of mental illness as well.
Absolutely.
Totally. I had a very similar experience myself.
Yeah.
Should we finish off with, I just want to talk about her friendship with Paula.
Yep.
I really love their friendship. I see ourselves in it a little bit. Without the, like, breaking laws together stuff.
Yeah. No breaking laws, perhaps a little less dysfunctional.
Yeah,
and
less enmeshed.
And a little less, like, weird mother-daughter vibes.
Yes.
A lot less.
I feel like we're pretty equal.
Yeah.
More sister vibes here.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I think they sort of fulfill a role for each other, where Paula is the secure mum and to Rebecca, and Rebecca is the daughter that she never got to have. So
absolutely,
they're very almost. It can turn into a bit of a toxic dynamic, and you see Paula, like she says, I think in season 2, like she feels addicted to or intoxicated with Rebecca's drama, and starts pulling back, and you see Rebecca sort of accept it, but also see it as rejection as well, and that's when they have some of their biggest fights.
Absolutely.
I thought the caveat of it being a musical and very embellished, I thought it was pretty accurate. Yeah, I've been in similar friendships.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's definitely a very relatable kind of situation to get into with a friend sometimes, when you do become so enmeshed in each other's lives, and they can be, you know, with certain people, very one-sided situations to be in, and certainly very frustrating. I wonder if they were real people. Well, I suppose Paula got a lot out of it too, right? Like, I often think, like, why did she stick around when, you know, the reality is, and they sort of address this in the show, that Rebecca's never asking about Paula's life.
No.
You know, she doesn't really get to be the star in their friendship. I don't think this is like our friendship at all, Steph.
No, it's not. No, just
Who
the
is the
love
star?
they have for each other, you know.
Yeah, no, for sure. The closeness.
We are both the stars.
The closeness, definitely. They talk about that sort of one-sided nature a lot in the show. And yeah, I do wonder about how effective that friendship, or how long-standing that friendship would be in real life.
Yes, I agree.
I don't know.
Yeah.
We'll never know, because they're not real people, they're characters.
No, but I think they go through their rocky patches, which I think makes them stronger at the end. And you see, again, I think it's the last episode, which I obviously watched like a few hours ago. Rebecca starts to listen to what Paula's saying, and Paula's like, oh, yeah, you listened to me. Well done. And, you know, they're always there for each other in rough times, regardless of whatever's been happening.
Absolutely.
So it shows the strength.
Yeah, and it's certainly, as much as I think, like, if you were to add it all up overall, it's a little one-sided. We do also get to see some of that really nice, like, loving friendship from Rebecca throughout the show, and that, you know, when Paula needs her, she is there, and she does want to go out of her way to help her and come and look after her kids. And, you know, whether she's in a position to be doing that is one thing, but certainly the desire is there to help her friend and support her and show her a lot of love, and it's really nice. Yeah,
and I like that Paula exerts those boundaries. They're eventually sort of accepted for what they are, and I think it's a representation of how sometimes you need to do that with a friend, even though you love them so much. You sometimes for yourself and to stop your own sort of toxic habits coming through, because she sort of neglected her family for Rebecca.
Absolutely.
Sometimes you need to exert boundaries and do them in a way that serves both of you.
Yeah, and even if, you know, Rebecca sort of pulled back a little bit at first, that ultimately was much better for their friendship.
Yeah, exactly.
More, sustainable.
let's talk about stereotypes in this show, and we'll start with what is subverted as a stereotype, because I think it does a lot more of that than it does of actually pushing stereotypes.
Agreed.
Firstly, I guess the manic pixie dream girl is basically what Crazy Ex-Girlfriend is trying to subvert. Like, if this person really existed, they're not the dreamy person that has no backstory that you want them to be.
Exactly, yeah. Some of the behaviour that we sort of associate with the manic pixie dream girl, like if you actually flesh that person out into a three-dimensional character, would probably look something like Rebecca.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Maybe secondly, I think it does a really good job of subverting the stereotype that living with a mental illness, particularly something as stigmatized as borderline personality disorder, is always going to be a terrible time, Yeah. That it's a horrible, horrible way to live and nothing good will happen and that sort of thing. And often when we see depictions in media, as we've seen in some of the shows and the movies that you have talked about, they're quite sort of catastrophic and everything goes wrong and it's all very terrible and there's not much redeemable about the person at times.
Yeah.
Whereas I think the show, does a really good job of subverting that by showing that, with time, with the right support, she's able to develop really healthy relationships. She gains a lot more stability. And also even throughout, she has this wonderful creative inner world. She's a loving, wonderful friend. Some of her relationships might be a bit dysfunctional at times, partly driven by her own, experiences and her own borderline, also partly driven by issues that her partners are certainly experiencing at the time, which I think is relatable for a lot of people.
Definitely.
But ultimately, she is able to live a fulfilling and full life.
Yeah, a creative life too by the end of it.
Absolutely.
And I think just in terms of borderline itself as well, when you go back to movies like Girl Interrupted, it's like, you don't want to be with this girl. She's sexy, but she's crazy.
Yeah, she's a handful.
Yeah, it really smashes the stigma about borderline. And there's not really a lot of movies or TV shows that touch on that, apart from it being stay away from this borderline crazy person.
Yeah, absolutely.
It also smashes the stereotype around medications, as we've already discussed, which I so love.
Cool. I think it also does a really, really great job of sort of combating the idea that if you are living with a mental illness, like all you need is to find the right partner. If you fall in love, you get married, you'll have a wonderful life and everything will be better.
Just love will cure it.
Exactly. Or that, there's a very simple solution. You'll just go on some medication, take an SSRI and you'll be all good. Or you start seeing a therapist and suddenly you're all enlightened and everything is good in life.
And your life is just perfect.
Yes. Yeah. When it's certainly, obviously not as simple as that. And that's definitely a trope that we see across
most
representations, certainly. I think even outside of TV shows and movies that are specifically about mental illness, like that is a trope that is in
real life.
Everything.
Yeah.
Oh, real life for sure. Yeah, definitely just real people. But, I'm even thinking of one thing I will always bring up with this is the Wonder Woman movie, the first one of
I haven't seen it, sorry.
Yeah,
you know me.
So I wanted to love that movie so much. I did, a female lead, it's wonderful, like it'll be great, and I'm into superhero movies anyway. And then I felt like, spoiler alert, although I won't say anything specific, I felt like what it boiled down to was that in order to find her strength, she fell in love with a human man, and that answered everything, and that's how she found it in herself to overcome whatever the villain was in that particular movie.
Well, you might as well tell me the whole plot because I'm not going to watch it now.
Okay, well, I don't want to because I don't remember because I never watched it again because I was infuriated. So I think that is a very pervasive trope, and I think that they do a really good job of showing the realities of the complexity of how you address these sorts of things.
Yeah, because she uses infatuation as a way to be happy, essentially. And then by the end of it, and spoiler alert, she doesn't get with any of the boys.
Yes.
She realises that that's not true happiness. And then she can marry either of the three boys, have a great marriage. I keep saying three boys. She's not going to be happy at the end of the day. She needs to find something. She needs to find out who she is, and sometimes that's a bit harder than just deciding to write some songs. But it takes time, and it did take time in the show.
It did.
But you need to find your own true sort of happiness and it's not. You're not going to be happy forever, but something that gives you your life meaning and value. And I think. Yeah, it really slams that trope Slams the door in the face of the trope.
Some relevant topical comment on slapping things in the face. Inserted here.
Is there anything that is a bit too tropey and stereotypical?
Look, I think it's really hard to speak to this point with this particular show because, you know, the show is a bit silly and a bit campy and you know, it does like walk that line between, are we implying that this is what the reality is of people who are living with mental illness, or are we kind of playing things up a little bit for the show, and is that the same thing, and is it problematic? And I'm not sure where I land on that, to be honest, but certainly they do have a lot of sort of very outrageous hijinks, very extreme decisions that they make. You know, she'll break into the boy that she has a crush on's house to delete a message on his phone that she accidentally sent. Quite extreme.
Wouldn't we all love to do that?
Oh, yeah, if you could.
Playing out our fantasies.
Wouldn't you? Gets her best friend to fake a break-in at her house so that she has an excuse for him to come over, more or less. Like, quite, you know, quite the hijinks they get up to.
Yeah, quite extreme situations.
Yeah, and perhaps a little cartoonish, definitely. But, you know, it's a fun musical.
Show. Yeah.
It's a silly show.
Yeah.
It's a silly show.
It works because of that reason.
Yeah.
I think my only big criticism of the depiction in Stereotypical was that flashback that you only see for a very short period of time, and maybe it was happening in her mind when they find out who Robert is, back to the institution that she was in, where it's all very grey, the colouring is all washed out, and she's looking very sedated and not really present, and an orderly who's like really gruff says, you know, what's her deal? She just sings all day. Like that, I don't think that was a very helpful depiction of institutions.
No. Probably accurate for some small minority.
Could be.
Possibly in America, but I don't think generally representative of modern mental health hospitals.
No. And sometimes there's a place to be in a mental institution.
Oh, absolutely. It's a very important part of care for many people. Yeah. And so, yeah, not super helpful to depict it in that way. No. Where the staff are sort of almost mocking her, being very disrespectful, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's all I had, really, in terms of stereotypes.
Yeah, there's not much. We're trying not to be biased, but it's just exceptional.
Trying to dislike it. Can't. Well, let's finish up with helpful or harmful. And again, I think we've pretty much said that we think it's really helpful for many, many reasons. So we won't go too much into it. But I think essentially we really root for Rebecca at the end of the day. We love her. Even though she's so complex and has lots of flaws, we still root for her. We want the best for her.
Absolutely. I'm not really a part of like the online fan community, but from what I've read and seen, like I don't think anyone was outraged with the ending of her choosing herself essentially over the men.
I think they would have been if she chose a man.
I think so, possibly, which I think really speaks to how much we are invested in her and her well-being and her story, and not like, you know, getting too obsessive over particular couples in the show. I'm sure everyone has their favourite, Nathaniel, but I
think I liked First Greg better. I would have gone with First Greg.
Yeah, that's anyway. And so I think that really speaks to the fact that they really managed to get us on her team, and that is so helpful for particularly someone with a condition which is so often stigmatised and not very well represented in media at all.
Absolutely.
So something else that is helpful, I suppose it just speaks to, you know, what we've already covered in terms of accuracy, like her journey that she goes through with her diagnosis of initially kind of being in denial, coming to terms with it, coming to terms with what it means, what her treatment plan is going to look like, that sort of thing. We talked about that kind of roller coaster of emotions relating to her diagnosis being quite relatable and quite accurate. And I think that is especially helpful. You know, all of the very accurate portrayals of experiences related to borderline and mental health in general are very helpful. But I think that in particular is something that I don't think I've ever seen.
No, and I've actually never seen the DSM directly quoted accurately. Yeah, like when Dr. Akopian goes through all the 9 traits. They are the 9 traits.
Yeah.
It's a far cry from when we did Identity, and they're like, he's a category 5 dissociative, which is not a thing.
Not a thing. Was never a thing.
I don't know what that is.
Doesn't come from any version.
So it is really helpful for someone to actually see what that experience is like.
Absolutely.
And that it's there's so much hope there. I like how at the end we see hope for her, whereas a lot of people, if they see I've got a diagnosis of BPD or any personality diagnosis, the feeling might be hopelessness.
Absolutely.
Or doom, which is really not what you see in this, which is great.
No, indeed. It is also a very diverse cast, as we've talked about, which is helpful.
Very helpful representation.
Very good. Obviously, there's some holes there, as we would expect. There's no main characters with disability, for example.
No, not many. Can't think of any. And it's kind of, when there is some sort of like visual difference, it's seen as a bit of a joke.
Yeah. So that's
not good.
That's not ideal, is it? No, it's not good. But generally better diversity than we generally would see in a like CW sitcom.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So it's
and LGBTI storylines too of coming out.
Absolutely.
That is a like a revelation for Daryl, but then not really a revelation for Valencia.
For sure, absolutely. We didn't even get to talk about that. God. I mean, we are covering 4
much.
seasons of a show in one episode. So there's a lot there that we could talk about. But yes, certainly that representation is wonderful as well.
Is there any ways it could be harmful, Elise, Dr. Elise?
So in terms of ways that it could potentially be harmful, I suppose that, inherent in the fact that it is a musical and it is a bit of like a sitcom. Other than that, it's quite lighthearted. It's very campy. It could be perceived as sort of making light of some very serious things.
That's true.
I don't think that anyone in this room would think that is, blanket rule a bad thing. Like not to make light of, but to, have fun with our depictions of those things and with our understanding of them and our representations of people as whole human beings who, yes, have parts of themselves that might be quite dark and difficult to deal with, but also have dimension.
And it kind of makes it accessible in this format, which makes it's obviously portrayed in a fun way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's kind of like incepting people who like musicals and fun things into also becoming more aware about mental illness.
Absolutely. Although it does run the risk of perhaps limiting its audience a little bit because it is hard to get people to watch it because it is a musical and you describe it to them and they're like, I think I'm okay.
And, I'm overthinking it so much. Yeah. Could it, presented in a musical format, make you think, only people who like musicals will get it?
Yeah.
Or will have that mental health illness awareness or have that mental illness?
Yeah. I hope not.
I don't think so.
I hope not. But it does potentially limit its audience. But I don't think that makes it inherently harmful for me.
No.
It might, reduce the impact overall, but I don't think it makes it harmful.
But that's putting a lot of pressure on its shoulders to be more accessible than it already is, which is often the case.
And to make a perfect show with a diverse cast that covers a range of very important issues in a really fun but serious but accurate way that is appealing to everyone.
And look, it does
a little much to ask.
As good a job as it can.
It does a fantastic job. I did see a very interesting, it was a TikTok, I'll just be honest, discussing this idea of, comparing Rachel, I've got to swap between my names, Rachel Bloom and her creation of Crazy Ex-Girlfriend and the recent, Inside, the special from Bo Burnham.
Yes.
Because a lot of the time people do think like, it's like a silly, like you're limiting your audience. It's a kind of a thing for girls.
Yes.
And that sort of thing. When I think, Inside is evidence that those kinds of, musical comedy, really relatable, really real issues, but also a lot of fun and a bit silly at the same time. It's almost like the exact same genre of content, really.
Exactly, yeah.
And yet Inside has had such penetration in society. It's so broadly applauded.
Everyone watched it. Everyone loved it.
Yeah.
It was
and there was no question
rated.
of, but it's a musical.
No one was concerned about that I spoke to.
No.
I spoke to everyone.
Yeah, no. And I certainly, I do encounter people in my life who are resistant to watch Crazy Ex-Girlfriend because of the fact that it's a musical.
Yes.
Who I think simultaneously loved Inside. So
yes. I do. So do you think it's a gender thing?
I do think it's a gender thing. Mm-hmm. I'm going to play the gender card.
Play the gender card.
And that I do think it is more difficult for Rachel and for Rebecca, the character, as a woman to gain that sort of broad appeal. I think it comes back to that trope of the general society, i.e. men, deciding that things that girls like are not cool.
Yes.
And so I think it's done a wonderful job of having such an impact that it has, despite fighting against that particular
Exactly. I totally agree. I do wonder, though, because Crazy Ex-Girlfriend is like 4 seasons.
It is.
They're quite long episodes.
They are.
Whereas Inside is 2 hours.
Yeah, for sure.
So there's that. But
There is
also,
that,
it's also not that because, you know, Succession is 4 seasons with long episodes and everyone raves about it. So it's not the same thing.
it's not that much of a show, and like you don't have to work that hard to convince someone to watch Inside, whereas you do have to work that hard to convince someone to try Crazy Ex-Girlfriend.
And even then they won't.
Yeah, and they won't.
That's so true. And it just speaks to the fact that we still don't have adequate female representation and love for those female represented shows.
Absolutely. And also just respect for things that women like.
Like what we like. They're good.
Usually they're good things, and also sometimes they're things that might involve really complex depictions of mental health experiences and emotions. And I know that men are afraid of that, but we put it in a nice, fun musical for you. So
Yeah. So sit down, shut up and watch it.
yeah.
Should we think about our final scores?
Yes.
We'll see what it comes out as.
Try to be nice and balanced.
Try to be balanced. Firstly, lived experience. Does it get...
This is a great question, actually.
Yeah. Do we grade it at all?
I mean, we have to grade it because otherwise what will you do with your graphic at the end of the year?
I don't know. Oh, there's a shrug shoulders emoji that we use. I don't know. I think we should grade it because even though it didn't set out to be about BPD, once it did set out to be about BPD, we can assess them on how well they brought people in with BPD in the show. And I don't think they did.
They didn't.
But they did talk to psychologists.
They did, which is not the same thing but is helpful. And I do think we have to give them some credit for the fact that, you know, initially when they were writing the show, Rachel was writing about experiences that were true to her life and that were very personal to her. And sure, ultimately it ended up with the character receiving a diagnosis that she has not had. But I don't think it's fair for us to discount, you know, the lived experience that she does have that's relevant to the experiences in the show before the diagnosis.
I agree. Maybe we give them half a point.
Yeah.
Are you comfortable with half a point?
I'm comfortable with half a point.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Elise. Accuracy. I think in the context of it being a musical, I'm pretty comfortable with giving it a point because it nails things more than most shows do.
Agreed. It did a wonderful job. You know, perhaps accidentally at first, but
then
doesn't matter. It was wonderful.
Some of the best things are happy accidents.
Exactly.
Stereotypes. I think this is a hard one too because it is a very over-the-top sort of representation. I think it smashes so many stereotypes at the same time that I think I'd like to give it a point.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Good.
Yeah, I think it does such a productive job of smashing them. that overcomes any of that. Like, to be honest, we were trying to be balanced.
We were trying.
And I think that, you know, we can give audiences enough credit that, you know, they can appreciate that something's a little bit campy for a TV show.
Yeah,
and it's not meant to be taken very literally.
It can be both things.
It can be both things, for sure.
And, you know, you audience are welcome to tell us your thoughts if you disagree.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think helpful or harmful is pretty clear that it's definitely helpful.
Very harmful.
Harmful for my ability to get stuff done because I love watching it all the time.
I'm perpetually rewatching it, and I'm very sad that it doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
Although it ended probably appropriately, and I'm glad that it didn't go on too long.
Yeah, and I love watching the special at the end where they're all on stage. It's just
so wonderful,
so beautiful.
and they're so talented.
I really hope she does more stuff. I haven't really heard, apart from her appearing on RuPaul's Drag Race a fair bit.
Which was exceptional.
Yes.
She is an exceptional guest judge.
Very much so. She also comes on the Drag Her podcast a fair bit to talk about RuPaul.
Nice.
So, but other than that,
I think she's been busy having a baby.
Yeah, she did have a baby.
Yeah.
Also, I didn't mention this earlier, co-writer Adam Schlesinger sadly passed away of COVID early on in the pandemic, which is really devastating because he was extremely talented. He co-wrote most songs.
Yeah, very sad, very sad.
Well, on that sad, somber note,
Indeed.
and the siren that we can hear.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks for having me,
I
Steph.
had such a good time.
I've had a lovely time.
I'm really honoured to have you here. And please, if you are interested in Elise's research, please check it out. Follow her on Twitter. She'll tweet you with latest stats on sleep.
It won't just be stats. Sometimes it's fun commentary on
and fun commentary.
science and I don't know.
And also just general
stuff.
levity.
General stuff.
Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Don't forget to subscribe to our Patreon if you'd like some bonus content, including potentially some bonus stuff with Dr. Elise.
Oh.
And give us a rating. Give us a rating on Apple Podcasts. We need more.
Do it.
We need to bump up that score. Thanks for coming.
Much appreciated.
And we'll bring you out with a rendition. No, I'm joking.
I was doing a little bit of practice in the car on the way here, thinking like, what if I break out into song accidentally partway through? I cannot. I simply cannot allow you to have that.
Yes, you
file.
can. You practiced. You practiced.
I was practicing for myself.
Which one though?
I don't know. There's too many to choose from.
Well, my favourite is having a few people over.
That's pretty good. It's pretty good.
Because it's just so great.
It is excellent. I can't pick a favourite. I think probably if you forced me to, it's going to either be Generalised About Men or the end of the movie.
Yeah.
The life's just a series of revelations that occur over a period of time. It's not some carefully crafted story. It's a mess and we're all going to die. And on that note,
goodbye.
Bye-bye.
This podcast is not designed to be therapeutic, prescriptive, or constitute a formal diagnosis for any listener. For a longer version of this disclaimer, please check the episode notes on your podcast app.